Hello, this is just a recording for, well, mainly for the Suffolk Jungian Circle, but of course, as with previous recordings for that group, it may be of interest to other people who are not members of the Suffolk Jungian Circle. So for the January meeting, which takes place at the end of the month, we've decided to talk about the Shadow Archetype. I have made recordings about the Shadow before, but I thought I'd pad it a little bit and kind of take slightly different angles and make a new recording on this one. In terms of Jung's approach, he takes Freud's fundamental idea of the id, which, for anyone unfamiliar, Freud proposed that infants are born without a defined ego, a defined sense of identity, without a superego, which is the moral function of the mind. They develop later. The newborn baby is pure id. So the id is the very impulse-driven, sensory-driven part of the mind. When it's hungry, it wants to eat. When it's tired, it wants to sleep. When it needs a pee, it wants to pee there and then, rather than as an adult will, or an older child will learn to kind of keep your legs crossed until you can get to the toilet. So the self-control that enables you to delay eating till a certain time of day, even if you're hungry, that enables you to defer sleeping even if you're tired until a certain point of time, that enables you to learn enough muscle control that you can keep your legs crossed until you can get to the toilet and go, rather than just pee yourself there and then. All of that is something that, well, quite obviously develops later in the child. The newborn baby isn't capable of any of that. And so the id is that rather newborn-like self, the neonate, which has these urges and wants to express them there and then. Now, clearly, those sorts of physical urges for food, for sleep, for going to the loo, etc., are not evil impulses by any stretch of the imagination. That's quite an important thing to emphasise, because a lot of kind of pop psychology end of literature, which is written by people with maybe a more simplistic grasp of the concepts they're writing about, often misses that point. And when it's talking about either the id in a Freudian context or the shadow in a Jungian context, often does talk about these two forces as being evil. And whilst there is certainly a capacity for evil to develop, such as the child gets physically older and bigger and larger, an id response to frustration is to get angry and to lash out at the person or object or animal or whatever it is that you're angry at, to punch it or bite it, kick it, whatever, which is a bit annoying in a toddler, but in a full-grown adult could clearly be very, very dangerous, if not indeed murderous. And you could argue that a 6-foot-tall adult who cannot control their anger, somebody, their other half burns the dinner and they lash out and batter them to a pulp, maybe even kill them or hospitalise them or whatever, that is tipping into evil. That is becoming dangerous inability or unwillingness to control rage and anger. So it can become, in an adult, it can become a source of malignant, dangerous, nasty behaviour. But in and of itself, as it exists within the newborn child, it's not evil. It's simply impulse driven. It's the natural primal urges of the body, of the mind, without any restraint, without any civilizing influence that says, even if you are angry at someone, you can't punch them. That says, even if you are hungry, you can't just grab the nearest bit of food off somebody else's plate and jam it in your mouth. That says, even if you do need to go to the loo, you can't just crap on the floor. You've got to wait and go to the toilet, and so forth. So you've got to learn self-control. The basis of any civilized life is a degree of restraint, a degree of learning to control your impulses, to either defer them to a certain point in time or to only articulate them in a certain way, so that you can verbally articulate your anger and say, well, you really annoyed me there, but you can't kick somebody's face to a pulp. So you can express your anger in one way, but you can't express it in another. All these blatantly obvious things are the basis for Freud of superego development, that moral conscience that says you cannot do that now. You've got to wait till later. Or it says you cannot express that feeling in that way. You can only express it in a certain other socially acceptable way. That is something we acquire through socialization. And Freud himself made the quite obvious statement that different kids get different levels of socialization. Some, a bit like a Goldilocks, some have far too much. They have very controlling, very rigid parents, or whoever it is that's raising the child, who instill so many inhibitions the child is practically rigid and barely knows how to behave. Is fearful of behaving, I should say, fearful of doing anything because they've been told practically every single thing they do is wrong. Or they're under-socialised, the opposite end of the Goldilocks side of the spectrum, where they have so little restraints put upon them as a child, they're neglected or just left to run wild, that as they get older they're a bloody nightmare to be around because they've got no manners, no sense of appropriate behaviour. They're greedy and selfish and just generally a bit unpleasant to be around. Freud's point being that lots of people have impulses, in fact most people, pretty much all people have impulses to be greedy, to be angry, to be lustful as they get into puberty, but almost all of us learn sufficient self-control that we don't snatch food off people's plates, we don't just grab someone because we fancy them and sort of do untoward things with them. We don't just act on impulse, that we all have the impulses, but most of us learn to restrain them. It's the unsocialised who have not learned to restrain them. Or as Eric Fromm spoke about, and what was his face? Sandor Ferenczi spoke about the very narcissistic child who has super indulgent parents who treat the kid like they're a mini god who can do no wrong. And so their under-socialisation doesn't come from neglect, but it comes from overindulgence, where there's been no one has ever said no to that child. Nobody has ever imposed consequences or punishments on the child for misbehaving. So that whatever they've done, they've always been patted on the head and said, well done. If you want to punch that kid, you go and punch that kid. It doesn't matter. And that's also a form of under-socialisation, but from a different motivation, a different kind of standpoint. So the shadow from a Jungian point of view is the id that develops and goes on as the child gets older and eventually enters into adulthood, that we all have this impulsive side to ourselves, these impulsive urges, which most of us learn to restrain, but they're still there. And under certain circumstances, drink, drugs, whatever, your capacity to restrain yourself might be lowered. And so there may be occasions when a normally well-behaved person lets rip, and you, as an observer, you see the impulses that they normally keep under wraps when those inhibitions are lowered through some, let's say drink, drugs, or whatever it may be that has lowered their inhibitions. And so you get a glimpse of their inner shadow. But also he argues, Jung, that social experiences add to the shadow. Now, the social experiences that add to the shadow have to be understood in a variety of contexts. Traumatic events, death, bereavement, violent assault, sexual abuse, a long list of things that could go on, horrible, painful diseases, things like that might happen to a person and leave them emotionally scarred, mentally scarred. If they don't learn to deal with that scarring, that suffering, that traumatic event in a healthy fashion, then that unhealthy scar, that kind of scabbed over wound of the mind, of the soul, of the psyche, that becomes part of the shadow because it's never been dealt with. And at some point, if the individual lives long enough to do so, of course, in the first place, at some point they will have to try and learn to deal with that. But that could take 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. I mean, who knows how long it could take for them to get to the point where they can address and process that unresolved wound. And whilst it remains unresolved, it's continuing to influence the person's behaviour from their unconscious mind. Because for Jung, as for Freud said the id is largely unconscious. Occasionally it kind of bubbles up into consciousness and you get a glimpse of it, but most of the time it's unconscious. So for Jung, the shadow is mostly unconscious. And sometimes it's easier to see somebody else's shadow than it is to see your own shadow. As per I can't remember off the top of my head which verse it is in the Bible, but the bit about seeing the mote in somebody else's eye and not the log in your own. In other words, you can see when they're doing something shadowy and dark and nasty, but you're often oblivious because it's unconscious to your own nastiness, your own shadow impulses. Until you learn to process it and bring things into consciousness, which we'll get on to as we go along. So he talks about this idea that it's like a blind spot. Within ourselves, we are frequently unaware of our own nastier impulses. We deny them. Or if we're kind of maybe semi-aware, but we don't want to talk about them, we don't want to think about them, we kind of shunt it to one side and say, oh, well, it wasn't me, I just had a little bit to drink, and I'm not really like that, but Jung would say, and actually you are like that. So if you turn into a violent drunk, or a lusty drunk, or a miserable drunk, or whatever kind of a drunk you turn into, that is you. That always is, not all of you, but it's a large chunk of you. And even if that bit only manifests after a certain number of pints, and the rest of the time you keep it bottled up, nonetheless, even when it's bottled up, it's still there. And it's still influencing you, it's still shaping how you think about the world, how you think about other people. And a tendency to perhaps project outwards. And again, this is Jung's point, it's also Freud's point, that we are especially sensitive to the bad behaviour of other people when it mirrors our own bad behaviour. So when other people behave badly in a way that does not mirror us, it might kind of sail past us and go over our heads. We're not really paying attention to it. We think, oh, that's not very nice, but we kind of just shrug it off and don't think about it very much. But if it's too close to home, what they're doing is too much like what we would like to be doing, then we tend to react very strongly and become very censorious and wag our fingers and say how terrible, how awful, and we want to crack down on them and punish them and lock them up in prison, throw the key away, all the rest of it, because what they're doing is a bit too close to home to what we would like to be doing. And so we are acutely aware of that bit of somebody else's shadow, even if we don't pay too much attention to all the other bits of their shadow, until we get to the point of processing and dealing with our own shadows. And that's where we get onto this notion of shadow work. Now for Jung, where he's still retaining key notions from Freud, he talks about this blind spot. He says it's the superego's blind spot, so the moral consciousness, the superego that develops as a result of socialization. And there's for Freud, there's the sort of the positive and the negative bit of it. The positive bit is where your parents, carers, whoever it is that looks after you as a child, say to you, oh, you must do this, you must do that, you must do the other. So you've got this a list of musts. This is nice behaviour, this is good behaviour. You must wash up the dishes, you must pay your taxes, you must help old ladies across the road, you must do this, and this. The negative superego is the things you can't do. Oh, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, you mustn't do the other. You mustn't swear, you mustn't steal, you mustn't punch people. A big long list of all the things you'd like to do, but you're told you mustn't do. So you've got the musts on the one side and the mustn'ts on the other. Thou shalt not. Obviously, Freud was, even if he didn't practice Judaism as a religion, he was raised Jewish at any rate. So those kind of Old Testament thou shalts and thou shalt nots are very much there. And Jung, having been brought up as a Christian, again retains that same kind of notion. So when your superego looks at your id, one bit of you looks at another bit of you, if it sees that the id wants to do all the things that mum and dad and granny and the vicar and whoever else said you mustn't do, or it doesn't want to do the things that mum and dad and granny and the vicar said you really, really ought to be doing, then it is painfully aware that there is this bit of itself that wants to break all of the rules. And that is what it tends to have this blind spot about, that it cannot admit to itself that it has the urge to break the rules. It becomes very obsessed with other people breaking the rules. Again, projection outwards, it's very easy to moan about other people doing the things that you'd really like to do. And complain about their behaviours and their activities and all the rest of it, because you'd quite like to do it too. When they go and do things that you've got no interest in doing, you might not approve of it, you might know it's not a very nice thing that they're doing, but you're indifferent to it because it's not part of you, it's not something that you're bothered about. You can just say, not very nice, and move on. But you get hypersensitive about the things that are too reflective of you, too mirroring of your own soul. And that, from Jung's point of view, and Freud's point of view for that matter, is actually quite useful as a therapeutic technique, because if you can reflect to yourself what really, really bugs me about that guy over there or that woman next door is when they do X, Y, and Z, and you get really het up, not just slightly annoyed, but really het up, then that's, from a kind of therapeutic point of view, that's a good guide to probably what your own shadow is like, because what they've done is something you'd quite like to do, and that's why it really bugs you and it really annoys you. So you can take that annoyance, that anger, that moral outrage, or whatever you want to, however you describe it as, and use it as a therapeutic guide to self-awareness. And it's quite a difficult thing to sit back and think, actually, I can be a bit of a bastard. I'd really like to thump someone. I'd really like to hurt them. Or to say to yourself, I'd really like to nick everything in sight. I'd really like to go around doing weird sexual things, or whatever it is that you want to do. It's quite difficult to admit that you have the impulse to do these things that outrage you when other people do them, which is why it's often a slow process for an individual to get to the point in their life where they can say, yeah, fair enough, hands up, I'm a bit like that myself, and I need to address why I'm a bit like that and do something about it. It takes time to get to that stage. When Jung is talking about the shadow, he argues there's a kind of a two-layer, potentially three-layer actually, but we'll stick to the first two, structure to it. The top layer, the one that's in a sense easier to access, is the personal layer. The personal layer is built up of your own individual experiences. So the horrible stuff that might have happened to you in your life, whereas Freud focuses on the horrible stuff that happens to you in your very early life, Jung is taking a much broader picture, a bit like Erikson did, and saying that shadow can be added to throughout the course of your whole life. So if something really unpleasant happens to you when you're 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, that's still going to affect you and affect your shadow. It's not just a case of let's only ever talk about the things from the first few years of your childhood. It's a whole life perspective. But the horrible stuff that happens to you that you don't resolve, if you do resolve it, it doesn't form your shadow. It's a separate thing. But it's the unresolved trauma that becomes part of your shadow. And also that sort of superego element where if you're told thou shalts or thou shalt nots, and it directly relates to what you want to do, if it doesn't relate to what you want to do, it wouldn't be an issue. So if somebody said to me, you're not allowed to smoke, I'd think, well, so what? I don't want to smoke anyway. I don't like smoking, don't like the smell of it. It wouldn't affect me because it's not a thing I want to do. It's only where it directly impinges on the things that somebody does want to do that from a therapeutic point of view, it is restricting their urges, and therefore that potentially is layering in to the shadow side, because it is quite personal to them. So it's where they've been given a set of rules and restrictions from parents, from teachers, from priests, vicars, rabbis, imams, whoever it may be, that's layered moral injunctions of thou shalts and thou shalt nots upon them, that directly impact on their own personal urges and predispositions. That then forms potentially part of the shadow, because that bit of them that wanted to do so and so thing has now been told it can't do so and so thing, and that doing it is dirty or naughty or wicked or whatever, and they're restricted from doing it. Now, without dwelling too much on the religious angle, let's move on, because there is an element here where he's saying there's a kind of a sort of a cultural factor, both individual family culture as well as big broad culture, that it's not simply you're told God doesn't like that, so you mustn't steal, you mustn't lie, you mustn't cheat or whatever, but it's also cultural injunctions. So, for example, if you had somebody growing up in a very sporty family, they're all, they love their football and rugby and tennis and cricket and whatever else, and that child doesn't have much of an interest in sport, but they're really keen on art or drama or something like that, and the family regard that as all a bit rubbish. Why aren't you sporty? Why are you interested in all that crap? No, none of us like that crap. Why do you want to do it? Then the sensation that the kid grows up with, that the things they want to do are boring, stupid, irrelevant, worthless, not necessarily immoral in a religious context, they're just junk. And then they're not going to get praise from the family, they're going to be ignored or laughed at or ridiculed or whatever. Then they too become part of the shadow. And this is something that Jung was quite keen to point out, that the things that become part of the shadow don't become part of the shadow automatically because they are evil, but because they are disapproved of. So something that's quite okay, like wanting to paint pictures or play the guitar or tap dance or something, whatever, something that in and of itself is quite an okay thing, if it is disapproved of by the family, it's denigrated, ridiculed, etc., then that becomes part of the shadow as well, alongside the more nasty, destructive impulses like murdering and stealing and all that kind of business. So the shadow, from Jung's point of view, is not just those impulse-driven behaviours that we've already outlined, the hunger and anger and all the rest of it that are part and parcel of the infant onwards. It's also lots of other things that might only come into prominence when that kid is 8 or 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever age they are. As they grow up, that bits of them come to the fore that only mature at a later stage, after those few initial years that Freud tends to fixate on, that are then discouraged for some reason. And the discouragement could be just in that family. People think it's a stupid thing. Or it could be a broader cultural picture, that their culture in general, all of the neighbours, the people in the village, the town, the people in general in that culture think that's a stupid thing to do. Now, it could be that they think it's a stupid thing to do for anyone, or maybe as just a certain type of person. Boys don't do that, girls don't do this. And so there could be like a kind of a gender element going on there, where a girl wants to do something that is considered inappropriate for girls, or a boy wants to do something considered inappropriate for boys. It could be a social class thing. There's some very snobby families say, only the peasants do that, darling, we don't do that. And so it's seen as a kind of a down market thing to do. Or conversely, maybe someone growing up in a poorer family is told, well, we can't afford to do that, it's only the snobs up the road who do that, so you forget about it, you're never going to do that, we can't afford to do that, don't be stupid. And so something gets discouraged or repressed for a variety of possible reasons. And so the shadow becomes quite complicated. Now, underneath that top layer of personal experience, Jung argued there is the collective experience of the shadow. And that's kind of segueing into part of what I've just said about the collective element, the sort of social element, that most people in a given culture might think certain things are terrible. They could be historical things. You growing up in a culture where 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, there was a dreadful war, and this, your country went to war with that country, and they slaughtered, massacred multi-million people, and now we all hate the people in that country, even though that war was 100 years ago and everyone who took part in it is dead. But nonetheless, we've got this historical legacy that everyone from that culture is a complete bastard, because 100 years ago they did this dreadful thing to our great-great-grandparents. So there could be historical legacies that are peculiar to people from a culture, and another country 100 miles away might not have that same historical issue, might not have that same bit of their notion of what's wicked, what's terrible, what's dreadful. They may not have the same kind of hatreds. So for them, it would just think, that's a bit odd. Imagine hating that, bit strange. But for people from that culture, it's very standardized not to like individuals from a given culture because of some historical tragedy that took place, some dreadful war or whatever it might be that took place, that's left a scar on the collective psyche. So even though the individual you're talking to wasn't alive at the time that thing happened, nonetheless they've been brought up in the culture, they've had the stories, they've inherited the emotional wounds, but also they've inherited the fears, the anxieties, the worries that that bunch of people over there are really dreadful and wicked and terrible, and they might do horrible things to us just as they did them to our great-great-great-grandparents. So those fears come to be part of that culture. It may also be cultural in the sense of shame and dirtiness. So let's say you're brought up in a particular religion that says, eating pork is pork itself is dirty and filthy, or dogs are a disease, dangerous, terrible thing. You could have cultural fears and distastes based on religion, based on culture, based on history, based on whatever, that certain things are just horrible and dreadful. And so they become part of the shadow because they are charged with strong emotions of a negative nature. Fear, disgust, revulsion, terror, menace, a sense of threat. There is something about them that is unpleasant, nasty, and has to be separated off and put in a box. And the box, if you like, is the cellar of the mind in which the shadow dwells. It's cut off, we don't think about it, we don't talk about it, it's not very pleasant, it's nasty, it's dirty, it's disgusting. And even if you have no direct personal experience of that thing, nonetheless the very idea of it makes you go, yuck. That becomes part of the shadow, and it's there. And again, integration is not that you have to run out and do the thing you're disgusted by or anything like that, but that you have to come to examine and understand why it holds such a strong emotional revulsion to you, why it's such a source of fear or anxiety or whatever it may be, and gradually work towards coming to terms with it, integrating it, understanding the source of it, understanding how it impacts your behaviour, shapes your attitudes, your outlooks, your expectations. So the shadow work, which is the term used for coming to terms with your shadow side, is both the personal layer, which is usually the first thing you deal with according to Jung, and then once you've dealt with that, you tend to, you have the capacity at least to move on to deal with the more collective cultural elements of what's considered dark and terrible and dreadful and painful and nasty and shameful and all of those sorts of pejorative terms. So you move towards doing that. Now, in other recordings, we've spoken about the personality types, in thinking and feeling and intuition and sensation personality types. It gets quite complex and involved, and there are all these various Jungian therapists who develop these weird grids with tick boxes on them to try and understand how all these different functioning parts work. But the shorter version, we have touched on this in the videos about each of the four functions in turn. You've got one function, of the four functions, one tends to be dominant, at least when you're young. As you get older, they kind of get a bit more balanced, but when you're young, one tends to be dominant. And whatever is on the opposite side of the dominant one is referred to as the inferior function. So you've got the superior dominant function, the approach to life, the grasp of the world that you're most comfortable with, best at, if you like. Whether that's approaching the world through your intellect, through your emotions, through physical sensation, through leaps of imagination and intuition, whatever it may be. The opposite is the inferior, the least developed of the four functions. The one that you find hardest to cope with, hardest to understand, and when you meet people who are quite good at that, you can struggle to understand them. You might like them or you might hate them, and it can go either way. You might be very impressed that they're good at the thing you're bad at, or you might just find them so weird and strange that you can't relate to them at all. So you can go in either direction. But that is the bit of you that needs the most working on, because it is inferior. It's undeveloped. So if you've got inferior thinking, that's the least developed bit of you, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you're stupid, but it would mean that you struggle to think of things in a rational, intellectual way. And activities like reading and research and study and objectivity are a real challenge. Maybe you have very strong emotions, for example, and you can grasp something emotionally very quickly, and you can read other people's emotions very easily. You might be a really good therapist or counsellor or something like that, because you can read people very easily. But kind of intellectual work, delving into something at an academic, abstract nature, might feel like bashing your head against a brick wall. So you'd really struggle with those areas. That would then form part of your shadow. That you'd possibly fear those things, or be really bored by them, or really revolted by people who do them, and think, oh God, how are you a dreary person. They're so cold and clinical, and I can't get on with people like that. They're too stuck in their own heads. I can't relate to them. The flip side of that, if the feeling function is inferior, is that you find it very hard to read other people's emotions. You struggle to work out what they're feeling. You possibly struggle to work out what you are feeling. So if anybody turned around to you and said, oh, how do you feel today? There might be this really awkward silence, because you'd have your feelings. It's not that you don't have them. It's just that you really struggle to describe them, to put them into words, to get a grasp on them, a handle on what your emotional state is, and put it across to anybody else. So you wouldn't even possibly want to talk about such things in the first place. And you might find people who are very emotional, you might find them kind of gushy and overbearing, and you maybe prefer people who are more intellectual, that you can talk to them about ideas rather than talk to them about feelings. And possibly you'd really struggle, and you might come across and be seen as quite an unemotional person, possibly quite a cold person, because that bit of you is so underdeveloped that qualities like empathy, understanding what other people are feeling, having a sense of sympathy for them and their struggles and their pains and so forth, you might be able to engage in activities that other people would be horrified by. I suppose a fairly obvious thing that leaps to mind is something like vivisection research, which obviously does require a quite high level of intellectual understanding of chemical processes and biology and anatomy and so on, to engage in vivisection research on an animal. But a lot of people, if they saw a puppy, a monkey, or whatever it is, in distress, in pain, they wouldn't be able to do the experiment, because they go, oh, I'm really hurting this animal. So in order to do the experiment, you've almost got to be able to turn your feeling function off, or park it somewhere, to think, no, I've got to focus on the scientific process. I can't get drawn into the emotional bond with the animal that possibly is frightened or distressed or in pain or whatever it may be. If you were intensely emotional, you'd probably really struggle to do something like that. And you might not have much sympathy for a person who was good at doing things like that. You might think, oh, how could you possibly treat a little kitten in that way? How could you possibly conduct injecting chemicals into that poor beagle over there? And likewise, on the opposite side of the fence, that the person who's very good at that, because that's their function, might look on the emotional person and think, oh God, don't be so wet and gushy, and this research is going to bring about revolutionary medical treatments and save lives, and there's you weeping and wailing over a bloody kitten, you wet weekend, and they're to react in a very potentially very kind of dismissive way of those personality traits. So that sense that the superior and the inferior functions in both directions often struggle to understand each other. And for Jung, of course, the ideal of psychological maturity is to get both of them in a greater sense of harmony and balance. So there's no longer this sort of seesaw tilting. There is more of a unity between the two. And if we're thinking of the sensation and the intuition types, if somebody who is undeveloped on the sensation side, at one level may struggle to maintain their own body, healthy eating and exercise and things like that. Their body may feel like an irrelevance to them, or a bit of a mystery to them. They just don't understand how it works. That's a very kind of simplistic reading of the thing. Sensation is not just how you relate to your own body, it's also how you operate physically in the world. Structure, procedures, the ability to do things in an organised fashion, cleaning the house, doing the gardening, bit of DIY, practical hands-on physical material engagement with the world. So you'd really struggle with that if it was undeveloped. You'd be a bit clueless when it came to anything from paying the bills to keeping the house clean. Like, can't remember what their names are. There's a TV show, or used to be at any rate, of these two slightly peculiar women who'd go into the houses of hoarders and the people who'd got 10,000 newspapers piled up all over the place, and their houses were so dirty the cockroaches had walked out in disgust. And the two women who were professional cleaners as well as TV presenters would go in and rubber gloves on and scrub the house top to bottom, while these peculiar people who had made the mess in the first place kind of stood there looking aghast and wondering how on earth do you manage to turn all this chaos into order. The sensation type is very, very orderly. So someone who struggles with that, for whom it is undeveloped, that almost kind of like army mentality that has everything ordered and structured and the physical world under control and their body under control and all the rest of it. For the undeveloped person, that is just sheer chaos. That's an insurmountable barrier to pass, to cross. And the opposite side, the intuitive side, when that's underdeveloped, somebody could really struggle with anything imaginative. The sort of person who gets bored to death with novels and films and TV shows after 3 minutes, because it's all made up, it's all fantasy, none of it's real. Why does it matter? Who's interested in imaginary things? Because for them the imagination is so underdeveloped that they cannot lose themselves in flights of fantasy. So someone for whom the intuition function is very developed, they could spend half their life living in Hogwarts or living in Middle-earth or living in the Star Trek universe or wherever it is. They get very engrossed in characters, and it doesn't have to be fantasy. It could be EastEnders or Coronation Street, where the lives of fictional characters seem absolutely real to them because their imagination takes off and they get engrossed in plot lines and storylines and who's slept with who and who hates who and all this palaver. And they're carried away with it. Religion is kind of part and parcel of that. The idea that for some people, angels, gods, demons, allegedly historical figures who may or may not have existed thousands of years ago, have this absolute reality, and it shapes their lives, and they feel the presences of profound spiritual forces around them, whereas for some other people they feel nothing, and they cannot understand someone who says that they do. They just think, oh, you must be lying or demented or stupid or delusional or insane or whatever, because I've never felt these presences, I've never got a glimpse of angels dancing on pinheads, I've never had any of these fantastical leaps of imagination, therefore none of it's real. And you're just a crank, you're a fanatic, you're a nut job. which is where the function is, if you like, overdeveloped in someone who has way too much intuition, they may well become fanatical and cranky and so lost in a world of imaginative convictions that the more humdrum world of everyday life for other people is hard to grasp. And there are people who kind of get lost in fantasy. You know, they're so in love with Hogwarts or Middle Earth or whatever it is that they don't want to come back to what to them seems this profoundly dull, tedious, everyday, humdrum, quotidian existence that other people live in. An existence so tedious that the highly intuitive type just can't be arsed with it. And they struggle to, say, pay their bills, they struggle to get a job, they struggle to engage in ordinary everyday social activities, unless it's got this profound leap of imagination about it. So again, tendency to go to extremes, and the idea is to achieve a balance. So in terms of understanding what your inferior function is, your least developed of the four functions, that will give you a flavour of what your shadow will be like, where the areas where you'll really struggle, where you may be frightened or alarmed by either people who are really good at that thing, or perhaps other people who are frightened or alarmed by your complete inability in that area, and it makes you like the very cold clinical person who's got a very undeveloped feeling function. The apparent absence of that quality makes you seem quite alarming to other people. So there is a sort of an element there to think about. Now, one thing that Jung also said is that as you become more self-aware and you start to address your shadow side and you realise it's there and you admit it's there and you try and come to terms with it and deal with it, you can go through a period in that sort of initial self-awareness where you reach a moral inertia, and I suspect there's probably quite a lot of people, especially on social media, in this position of moral inertia. The things that you have previously thought of as wicked and evil and terrible, you now begin to reconsider as you integrate them into yourself. And you think, oh, well, maybe my anger, maybe my sexual urges, maybe my need for food, or whatever it is, isn't this wicked, terrible thing I've always been told it is, and maybe it can kind of exist in a more positive way. And part of the potential problem there is that you can then struggle to make any kind of ethical judgment, in that you question, as you start to question your inherited notions of what is wicked, you almost feel as if nothing is wicked. And a point that Jung wanted to make is that there are things in the world that are wicked. Genocide, paedophilia, necrophilia. There are things that are grotesque and wicked and awful and terrible. But you can, as an individual, you can get to the point where you've questioned the very notion of wickedness so much that even when real wickedness is staring you in the face, you don't see it. Jung said this is usually like a phase people go through before they eventually move on and develop to the point where they have enough self-awareness that they can then recognise that actually some things are dreadful. They're not just labelled dreadful, they actually are dreadful. Whilst somebody is in that kind of moral inertia phase, and this is, perhaps my experience of social media, I see a lot of people who go, they're so sort of tied up, especially in this social justice movement thing, where they kind of so on the side of everyone that's downtrodden, that they start to identify with people who quite possibly deserve to be downtrodden, especially paedophiles and necrophiles and whatnot. But there are individuals who they're not so much, how to put this, they're not so much integrating their own shadow side as they are aligning themselves with anything that they think of as being put into shadow. They're not asking themselves why it's been put into shadow. Almost the notion that, well, if it's been put into shadow, it's oppressed, it's abused. The poor little flower needs to be brought out of the shadow because that's what I'm trying to bring my own darkness out of the shadow, therefore I must bring everybody else out of the shadow. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, questioning who gets labelled as wicked and why, and are these labels always valid? There's not per se a bad thing to do. But it becomes deeply naive if the person no longer recognises danger where there is actual danger. A very, very, very short story. It's a traditional African story that's told of a very kind, caring woman who is walking home from market, having sold all of her fruit and veg on the market. She's walking home from the market and she sees this snake, big old snake on the road that's been trampled by wagons or whatever it is that's rumbled down the road beforehand. And she's a very kind, compassionate woman. She picks up this poor old snake, puts it in the basket, an empty fruit basket, and goes home. And for the next couple of weeks she's feeding it and doing all the herbal medicines and what have you, and she brings this snake back to full health, and it's restored and everything. And she realises it's now well enough to go back to the jungle, so she puts it back in the basket and goes to the edge of the jungle and releases the snake and says, "Oh, be free, little snake." And the snake turns around and bites her. It's a poisonous snake, and she's gasping her last as all the poison is searing through her body. And she says to the snake, for all these weeks I've looked after you, I've saved your life, I've restored you, I've given you medicines, I've done this, I've done that, I've done the other. Why on earth did you bite me? Why on earth have you killed me? And the snake looks at her and says, "I'm a snake. What did you expect?" And slithers off, and the woman dies. She's strong on the feeling function, possibly not so much on the thinking function, otherwise she'd have thought to herself, "This is a poisonous snake. Do I really want this in my house?" As a story, it's emblematic of a lot of situations people can get themselves into where they feel sympathy for something so strongly that they do not recognise actual threat, actual danger. Now, it's not to say the snake is wicked and evil and terrible, but it is to say the snake is dangerous. And whether we're talking danger from the animal kingdoms, danger from other human beings, danger from whatever, we need to recognise that there are things in this world that are a threat to us and to our nearest and dearest, and no amount of kindness and compassion and whatnot will make them any less of a threat, any less of a risk. And if you clasp them to your bosom, they're quite likely to bite you and kill you, rob you blind, do whatever. There have been various stories in the news of people who've engaged in kind, compassionate acts towards someone who's then turned around and killed them, robbed them, raped them, done something horrific to them, because that individual is so naive that they do not see danger where there is actual danger. And that's part of this kind of moral inertia. But it's, as I say, for Jung, it's not so much something you are doomed to think for the remainder of your life. Rather, it's more of a transitory phase you go through. And if you keep doing the work, the shadow work, eventually you come out of that phase and you think, hang on a minute, maybe that thing over there really is dangerous, and maybe I need to be cautious of it, and maybe there's a good reason why that thing was stuffed in the cellar in the first place. We have to kind of keep it in perspective. And the other just last element to wind up on is that for Jung, even though he says of the various phases, and we've touched on these in other videos, of the various phases of integration that the soul goes through to bring its various broken bits together and heal them and make an integrated whole. The very first one you have to do is the shadow. To work on your shadow, once you've done that, you then move on to other things like the anima and the animus and so forth. So it's the first stage, but it's not, he wants to emphasise, it's not a one-off thing. So it's not like you pay 500 quid, you go on some NAF course, you learn how to integrate your shadow, and then boom, that's you done. Thank you very much. Move on to the next thing. What he says is that you have the initial experience, the initial confrontation with your shadow. You make real good headway with it. You kind of you address these repressed parts of yourself, and you begin to integrate them and so forth. You may not like them terribly much, but you begin to integrate them. However, that's not the end all and be all, because for the rest of your life, however long that may be, you will have experiences where your shadow might start to grow again. And you have to reintegrate it again, and then again, and then again. So it's an ongoing, lifelong experience rather than this one-off, done it, tick the box, move on to the next session. Because part of the problem is, even once you've made that initial kind of integration and you've got to terms with a big chunk of your shadow self, that's like the personal, the top level. As you go into the cultural level, that's a hell of a big thing. That's a lifelong process. That's not something you can do on a weekend's course. That's something that's going to take you 20, 30, 40 years to start ploughing through that collective shadow of whatever kind of cultural upbringing you come from. And in an era where multiculturalism is more widespread than it was during Jung's lifetime, you could have actual several. So let's say you come from a culture that is a minority in the wider culture in which you live in, but you're brought up in it. So let's say your family are from one part of the world, but they move to a different part of the world. You'll have the collective shadow of your parental culture, but if you're brought up in another part of the world where there's a different culture, as you're brought up in that culture, you'll also have the collective shadow of that culture. So you could have two collectives going on at the same time, as well as your own private, personal, individual experiences. So it's not a sort of a clean-cut, straightforward thing for a lot of people. They've got multiple layers going on, rather than just the one. And they wouldn't, if they lived long enough, need to plough through layer, almost like archaeology, shadow archaeology, going through layer after layer after layer, working down through those understandings of cultural histories and collective experiences and individual experiences, and the fact, as a bit like Erickson's approach, this is a lifelong understanding rather than something purely focused on childhood. So you might learn to integrate the things that happened to you as a kid, but then when you're 30, something new happens to you, and you've got to learn to integrate that. And then when you're 50, something else happens to you, and you've got to learn to integrate that. So it's not as if bad experiences stop happening to you after you've made that initial integration with the shadow. Other things could happen to you a week, a month, a year, 10 years later, and that would then need integrating. And it may be stuff that happens directly to you. It may be stuff that happens to the people around you. Loved ones die or get ill or whatever, and the pain and the suffering and of that impacts your life as well as impacts their life. It could be global events happen, upheavals, changes, floods, famines, plagues, earthquakes, wars, stuff on a massive scale that happens that affects your life and the lives of the people you love and you care about, that you then have to come to terms with those things as well as whatever happened to you when you were 3 years old. So it's this ongoing process rather than a done it, tick the box, move on to the next thing. You have to keep coming back to it. And there is also an element there where as you become more attuned, more aware, you have a potential risk of getting a bit up yourself. You think, oh, I'm such a mystic spiritual guru, I can walk on my own bathwater now, I'm so amazing. And yes, you may have achieved quite a lot, you may have gained a lot of insights, you may be more aware of things than the bloke next door is aware of, but that doesn't make you the next Buddha, the next Jesus, the next whoever. And if you start acting like you are the next big cheese, and that you are this super duper mystic what's it, and everyone has got to kiss your sandals and treat you like Lord God Almighty, then that is part of your shadow re-emerging, a kind of a new bit of your shadow, the egomania, the self-importance, the power-crazed elements that can come to some people if they get too far up themselves. So even as you're kind of improving on this scale, you can start sliding down on that scale, and that becomes a risk that the shadow can just pop up again, from internal as well as from external sources. So there's all of that processing. Fiction has 101 characters in it. The villains of fiction usually are the embodiments of shadow. Whether we're talking cinema and TV or novels or stage plays or ancient mythology, I don't want to put that in the realm of fiction because that is understood for me, understood in a completely different context. But deities and beings associated with frightening, scary forces, whether it's ogres and goblins and things like that, or whether it's sort of the wild, the dark, the dangerous gods of storm and flood and famine and earthquake and scary stuff. There's all of these iconic figures, all the way from ancient myth down to, let's say, Voldemort or the Master, or what was the one in Star Trek? Khan, isn't it? Was one of them Khan, the Wrath of Khan? All of these various figures who are frightening and disturbing figures that can be understood in the context of the story as embodying the dark side of the main hero. That the hero is the light and the villain is the dark, but ultimately they are two reflections of one entity. And in some works of fiction that's maybe a little bit more obvious than it is in other works of fiction. But it's one way of studying stories, is to look at the baddie in the story and understand the relationship they have with the heroic characters and what makes them a baddie, why are they a baddie, how do they become this bad, terrible person. There are also some quite almost, well, not unique, but very rare takes in fiction from other angles, which would be worth thinking about. If anyone's ever read or seen the film of The Godfather, the first film and the original book, the first one in the set, the one about Michael Corleone, or Corleone, sometimes they say Corleone, sometimes they say Corleone, who starts off as a goody. He starts off as the nice son in this mafia family. But then the various other rival mafia gangs, they feud with the Corleone family, and Don Corleone, the old man, the patriarch, he gets bumped off, and one of the brothers is killed, and all sorts of things happen. And gradually, by the end of the book and by the end of the first film, Michael Corleone moves from being this squeaky clean heroic figure to becoming the new head of the mafia family. He gets darker and darker and darker and does nastier and nastier things. So he is descending into his shadow, which is very rare because most forms of fiction, the shadow is the baddie, the villain is someone else, and the hero is battling against the someone else. So the Godfather story is very unusual in that it's the hero is kind of battling and frankly losing the battle against himself. He is the one becoming the villain. And yes, there are these other families who do bad things and there's punch-ups with them, but they're not really the villain. It's Michael himself and his descent into darkness and corruption, which is quite a fascinating take and quite an interesting one. And why am I mentioning that? I'm mentioning that because, as we've said in either a video or in one of the discussions, I can't remember when it was said, I think there is a tendency to oversimplify. Joseph Campbell and other figures who write about the hero's journey as if there is one template of mythology, one template of fiction, and everything fits into that template. I think that's a real oversimplification. There are different templates. Some of them don't appear very often, like the Godfather template of the story of descent into darkness, the Nekia, the descent into the dark place. You don't often see that, but it's there as another template, not just the hero's journey. You could describe that as the villain's journey, I suppose. How do they become a villain in the first place? And there have been other, what was that Disney thing, Maleficent, where it tells a story of the nasty fairy godmother, the horrible one, and how she becomes horrible in the first place. Gives a bit of a backstory to that character. So it's the idea is that some forms of fiction, they're not always about good triumphing over evil. Sometimes certain forms of fiction are the descent into evil in the first place, and then later on you get the triumphing over it. But anyway, I think I've waffled on quite long enough there. So we'll leave it there. And if anyone in the group Jungian Circle wants to pick up on some of these ideas, some of it may appeal to you more than other bits. We can discuss that when we meet at the end of January. And if anyone who's not part of the Jungian Circle, who's watching this group, just wants to leave comments, feedback, suggestions, etc., please do. We can have a bit of a discussion going on there.